Logic is a tool for finding the truth. Now think about that example that we had in one of our other videos about the purple donuts and the tires. You may recall that we said, let's just assume for a moment that all donuts are purple. And then we said, let's assume that all tires are donuts. Now, if those things are actually true, then we can figure out something else about tires, which is that all tires must also be purple. Now, setting aside the ridiculousness of that example, it shows how powerful logic is for discovering the truth about something. Right? We didn't have to go and look at every single tire in the entire world. Right? We didn't have to go to the parking lot of a store and look at the tires of all the vehicles there. We could take two propositions, and from those we could deduce a conclusion and come to some aspect of truth. That's why we say that logic is really a tool for discovering the truth. Now, one of the earliest forms of that kind of logic or logical reasoning really is geometry. As soon as human beings discovered the relationship of angles and sides of figures, and the example that all triangles have 180 degrees to all of their angles, we were able then to build things and reason from that. That's how we were able to build things like the Great Pyramids. But really it was Aristotle, the Greek philosopher who lived from 384 to 322 BC, who really brought all this together in a formal way. And before we go on, I just want to point out, we're going to go through several philosophers. We're going to talk about their life and death dates and who they were and what they had to contribute to the field of philosophy. You want to make sure you're taking good notes. So if at any point you need to pause or even go back to catch some key information, be sure you do that. So as I say, we're going to start off with Aristotle, who lived between 384 and 322 BC. His most famous student was Alexander the Great, the world conqueror. But even more important was Aristotle's work as a philosopher. He wrote a work called Organon, which in Greek simply means the tool or the instrument. Again, we're back to the idea that logic is this tool for discovering the truth. One of the most important things that Aristotle came up with is something called the law of non-contradiction. This one's incredibly important, and I'll just give you a little sidebar on this. The law of contradiction says you cannot have both something and its opposite to be true. Okay? So for example, Christianity says that Jesus is God. Other religions, take Islam for example, there are others as well, that would say Jesus is not God. What Aristotle would say is, well, one of those statements is true. Now, he wouldn't necessarily come out and say which one, but he would say one of those statements is true and the other one is not. You cannot have both the thing and its opposite. Jesus cannot both be God and not be God at the same time. Now, after Aristotle, there was a group of philosophers called the Stoics. That's capital S-T-O-I-C-S, the Stoics, who lived in the 3rd century BC. And they continued his work in logic, and they really enjoyed thinking about things that we call paradoxes, things that seem logically strange or puzzling. For example, there's the famous paradox of the Cretan liar, the man from Crete, the island of Crete, who was a liar. And imagine this guy who always tells lies. And then he walks up to you and says, what I'm saying right now is a lie. What do you do with that? If he's lying about telling a lie, then he's actually telling the truth. But if you believe that he's telling the truth, he's actually lying. And so they like playing around with puzzles like that. Another one was the contest between Achilles and the turtle. And Achilles, a great warrior from the Iliad, obviously could run very fast. And they came up with this puzzle like, well, actually Achilles could not beat a turtle in a foot race. Right? Because if the turtle had to cover this much distance, and Achilles is going to race against him, right? Well, first, Achilles would have to cover half the distance of the turtle. Right? Before he could go the whole distance of the turtle, he'd have to go half the distance first, right? And before going that distance, actually Achilles would have to go half of that distance first. Actually, before that, he'd have to go half of that distance, and actually, it indicates that Achilles could actually never move. Now, we know that's not true. Obviously, people can move. But those were the kinds of things that they thought about. Then as we move on into the Middle Ages, it was a time of rediscovery of philosophy. People like William of Ockham, who lived from 1285 to 1347, did work in logic, and Ockham said this. He said, logic is the most useful tool of all the arts. And there again, we're back to the idea that logic is a tool that helps us discover things. Now, Ockham's name, that's capital O-C-K-H-A-M, William of Ockham. He's famous for something else called Ockham's razor. Yes, that's razor as in R-A-Z-O-R. And you know that a razor is something that's very sharp, right? So Ockham's razor was this statement that really just sliced through and cut to the heart of things. And it was a good one. He said, when all of the things are considered, the simplest explanation tends to be the best one. And we found that to be true time and time again. So he's building on the logic of Aristotle and coming up with new ideas. And then you've got this guy named Thomas Aquinas, who lived from 1225 to 1274. And Aquinas probably did the most of anybody with Aristotle's work. Aquinas used the logic of Aristotle to help understand and prove Christian doctrine. He specifically applied logic to the study of what we believe as Christians. And so important was Aristotle to Thomas Aquinas that Aquinas would simply refer to Aristotle as the philosopher. Obviously, there's been a lot of other philosophers, but he would refer to Aristotle as the philosopher just because he was that important. And I need to pause here for just a moment. Some of you may be thinking, what does logic and reasoning have to do with Christian doctrine, right? Christian belief. Isn't the Christian faith something that we're supposed to take on faith? What does it have to do with reason? Well, I want to introduce you to a guy named Anselm, who lived from 1033 to 1109. And Anselm said one of the most important things that I've read that really connects reason and logic with faith. And so important is this that I'm going to show you the Latin text, because he wrote in Latin, as most people did back then. I'm going to show you the Latin text. And as I read it, I want you to copy the Latin into your notes. And then we're going to talk about the English. So at some point, if you need to pause the video to make sure you get the Latin, go ahead and do that. Anselm wrote, Sicut rectus ordo exigit, ut profunda Christianae fidei credamus, prius quam ea praesumamus ratione discutera. Ita negligentiam mihi videtur, si postquam confirmati sumus in fide, non studemus quod credimus intelligere. Now, you should have the Latin for that copied. Go ahead and get the English as well. That basically translates, just as the right order of things compels us to believe the deep matters of the Christian faith before we dare to discuss them with reason, so it also seems negligent to me if, after we have been confirmed or strengthened in our faith, we do not study to understand what we believe. Again, you may want to back that up and play that a couple of times more to make sure that you've got the English, and when you have, continue on with the video. That is such an important quotation, I think, because it gets the right order of things. First off, we believe. Okay? You don't have to understand things. You don't have to get it all figured out. Right? We come to faith in Jesus because of his great love for us and what he has done for us. But then, after we've come to that faith in Jesus, I would agree with Anselm. It seems negligent not to try to understand what it is we believe. Think about anything else that you love or enjoy, be it a person or a sport or an activity. You come to love that thing or that person, but then don't you want to know more about it? Don't you try to understand it? Well, that's what logic and philosophy are all about. They're about tools. There's tools for helping us understand better the things that we believe. So logic really does have a role to play in understanding the Christian faith. Well, moving on now to the Renaissance and the Reformation. During that time period, people really began to question the prominence of Aristotle. They thought, well, maybe his stuff was good. He said, his logic in a way he thought was good, but maybe there's more. And there was this fellow named Francis Bacon, lived from 1561 to 1626. And he wrote a work called Novum Organum, which is literally the new tool or the new instrument. And he thought that we maybe need to think and reason in some ways that are a little bit different from Aristotle. He thought that we needed to base things on our experience and use inductive logic a little bit more than deductive logic. And I got to say, some good things came from that. He was the one who really gave birth to the scientific method and how we analyze and understand things about nature and the world around us. But deductive reasoning came back big in the 19th century. And there are a couple of big figures during that time period. There's a fellow named George Boole. That's B-O-O-L-E, George Boole. And he lived from 1815 through 1864. And he used propositional logic to explore hypotheticals and what-ifs and things that were not 100% certain. But he used that kind of logic to try to understand those things. He also came up with a particular branch of mathematics that we call Boolean algebra. That's B-O-O-L-E-A-N, based on his name, of course. Boolean algebra, which ended up becoming foundational to computer systems and how computers were built and work. And then there was this fellow named John Stuart Mill, and that's Stuart, S-T-U-A-R-T. John Stuart Mill, who lived from 1806 to 1873. And he focused on cause and effect and what's the logical understanding of one thing causing the effect of something else. And that paved the way for much of our understanding in science, in medicine, in psychology, and in the social sciences. So obviously logic has been incredibly important for over 2,000 years. And from the 1970s onward, it has really become a core part of a classical and Christian education. We realized that the huge debt that we owe to these philosophers who came before us, all the way back to the time of Aristotle. And we've realized that, just as Anselm said, we need to understand and explain well what it is we believe, certainly about our faith, but also about other things. And we realized that logic really is an important part of that sort of education.